Great. And we're live. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody. Welcome. IMS executive director, remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm the executive director of international support and welcome so much to this event, which is part of the lead up for democracy. This event marks the launch of IMS report public infrastructure. Digital journalism is now a data-driven world, and journalism's role in getting there. And thank you for tuning in from across the world. Those of you in Asia know it's late, and for those of you in America, thank you for getting up so early. I'm joining you from the headquarters of IMS in Copenhagen. It's been a sunny but snowy, cold spring day in Denmark. So I'll first give a few opening remarks, then I'll pass the floor to Anders Gravgaard, Chargé d'Affaires at the Danish Embassy in Myanmar. And after Anders' opening remarks, I'll pass the mic to my colleagues, who will introduce our panel, and they will moderate the rest of the event. So through history. Most of you
the sound is a little off on the live. Let's give us 1 second. Check with you more. Okay. Are you doing that too?
We hear the chat.
And so we have a little bit of a technical issue, and we'll be back soon. Morten, are you? Okay, we're just waiting for the sound.
Could one of our colleagues who's listening in please indicate if the sound is better?
The sound is fine from where I'm sitting.
Let's go ahead again, I think, and try. Okay, Morten? So, yeah,
okay. So I should continue?
Yes, please. Thanks, Jesper.
So for everyone joining us today, I'm sure you're aware that through history, information technology has been used with deadly consequences. And you may also know that IMS was founded specifically in reaction to the defining and absolutely catastrophic events of the 90s, the wars in the Balkans and the Rwandan genocide. And in both cases, shortwave radio was used to deliberately incite violence and hatred, leading to ethnic cleansing. Back then, one response from the international community was increased financial support to independent media, paired with capacity building training, and also an attention to ethical journalism, and also in setting up national institutions for media self-regulation. Essentially, ensuring that journalists and media could operate independently from political actors and have the skills, resources, and understanding to fulfill the profession's democratic role. And indeed, also then, as it is now, to counter deadly false narratives. But today, our technological reality has, of course, undergone fundamental shifts. A handful of American and Chinese companies own and govern main parts of our digital infrastructure, like search engines, like social media platforms, the app stores, undersea cables, and all of that. These infrastructures define, enable, but also limit our digital realities, including the amount of time and attention we spend consuming disinformation, or even, in contrast, consuming good quality journalism. Because of these developments, I would say the way we do media assistance has certainly evolved. Here's one example. 7 days after the war started in Ukraine, IMS facilitated a virtual roundtable with Google, Meta, Microsoft, Twitter, and local Ukrainian media partners, fact checkers, broader civil society, and government agencies. We did this together with the Danish Tech ambassador and the Danish Tech for Democracy initiatives. And the roundtables now in their second year has contributed to, I would say, real positive change in the local digital environment. That's our assessment, such as removal of Russian bots and amplification of local Ukrainian journalistic content on the tech platforms. Let me just quickly share 3 things we have learned from these so-called multi-stakeholder collaboration between tech companies, governments, and civil society. 1, this collaboration is the result of a deadly war. People are dying as we meet. And we can never forget that. Not many of the on the global stage had predicted the war. Neither had we. But because of an initiative like the Tech for Democracy launched by the Danish government in collaboration with civil society and tech companies, we were able to act fast on the request we got from our Ukrainian media partners to engage the tech companies at new and also sufficiently high levels. Point 2, the roundtables, they have confirmed to us how global companies really need local knowledge and deep contextual understanding to make the right decisions in their moderation, in matters of safety, and also matters of amplification. And we know that local journalists, and local journalists have a lot of that local knowledge and deep contextual understanding. Point 3, local collaboration and coalitions among journalists, fact checkers, broader civil society are essential to maximize impact directly with global companies, but also to build momentum around real local solutions. So building on these learnings, along with interviews around the world and 2 rather in-depth analysis of the situation in Myanmar, our new report sets out an ambitious vision for a future digital infrastructure that better serve the public interest. This is really important. To achieve this, we must inspire, we must incentivize and scale what we have called proactive tech and journalistic solutions anchored in local communities. You will hear more about this. These are rather technical terms, but I think it's very, very important to underline this. And we have to acknowledge that we cannot do this by ourselves. We need increased and new public, private, and civil society collaboration from local to global levels to achieve this very ambitious vision. So I'm therefore very, very grateful and excited to hear from today's speakers that represent cutting perspectives at this intersection of journalism and technology, from Myanmar to company to democratically minded governments. So take us one step further into this multi-stakeholder journey like you want us the Danish embassy in Myanmar, and you will give us your opening remarks. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Invited, and please let me first thank IMS for hosting today's online conversation, making tech and journalism work for democracy from Myanmar to Ukraine. And congratulations on your report. We're all looking forward to hear the main takeaways today. Well, I'm truly impressed also by the experience that has been gathered in this online room. I'm very much looking forward to listen and to learn from you all. Let me maybe start with saying a few words on Tech for Democracy. It's a Danish-led initiative that brings together representatives from governments, multilateral organizations, tech industry, and civil society to make technology work for democracy and human rights, not against them. While the Tech for Democracy initiative, with the Tech for Democracy initiative, Denmark has decided to contribute to the to accelerate the global efforts to make human rights and democratic values enjoy the same level of attention and respect online as well as offline. Around the globe, new technologies have proven their usefulness and shown their potentials in the struggle for democracy and human rights. However, there's also another side of that coin. digital technology is also increasingly exploited to oppress and monitor citizens and human rights defenders. As Jeannie's colleagues from Microsoft, Brad Smith and Carol Ann Brown, captured very well in their book with the title Tools and Weapons, the promise and the peril of the digital age. Repression practices like internet shutdown and the use of censorship, spyware, hacking tools against human rights defenders and journalists have become a pervasive feature for authoritarian states. This undermines the global free and secure and open internet and emancipatory power it can have for people around the world. Myanmar is a case of an example where technology is not working for democracy or human rights. And one of the first countries where we started the support to address this. In 2018, a UN fact-finding mission expressed their deep concern about the prevalence of hate speech offline and online and described the dire situation in Myanmar. Quote, a climate in which hate speech thrives, human rights violations are legitimized, and in sentiment to discrimination and violence facilitated. The background was, of course, as we all know, the conflict in Rakhine in 2017, which developed into a major humanitarian crisis, where systematic violence against Rohingyas forced more than 700,000 to flee to Bangladesh. Social media played a critical role. It was used as a weapon to reinforce atrocities. The military set up false accounts, creating platforms for nationalistic sentiments, often through the use of anti-Muslim and anti-Rohingya sentiments, which was used to incite discrimination, hostility, and violence towards ethnic minority groups. This tragedy led to severe criticism of Facebook and called for social media platforms to take increased responsibility for the published content. Opportunities for dialogue with tech companies, governments on the use of social media was opening. The Foreign Affairs of Denmark supported this process and organized, in cooperation with IMS, a multi-stakeholder meeting in 2019 called Multi-Stakeholder Dialogue Meeting on Social Media Freedom of Expression in the Digital Age and Prevention of Hate Speech in Myanmar. Representatives from Facebook and from Myanmar's civil society working on digital rights took part in this meeting. Following, we supported a year-long project in Myanmar managed by IMS, which was continued to support this multi-stakeholder process, while also developing other avenues to counter disinformation and hate speech. So it's a tested format, and as Jesper mentioned today, it is also now used in Ukraine. In Myanmar, the project became even more relevant after the military overthrew the country's democratically elected government 1st Feb 2021 and made the use of disinformation come back, and the military increased the control of the internet and social media platforms. So the question is, who controls the internet in Myanmar today? This is one of the questions that answered in the report that's being launched here today. As we will hear more in details, the answer, unfortunately, is very clear. The military is in control. The military can control access to the internet, both at national level and regional level. For a long time now, the military has shut down the internet in most of Chin State as a means to control communication under the conflict. The military can also access data on users and apply surveillance technologies. To what degree they are actually doing this is not clear, but if they will, they can. This weaponization of the internet and social media is nothing new in Myanmar. For Denmark, it's a priority to promote the positive vision of shared digital future that respects human rights and our democratic values. This vision is enshrined in the Copenhagen Pledge on Tech for Democracy that now has more than 200 signatories. The pledge gathers a community of stakeholders committed to a vision of a safe, responsible, and democratic digital future. As part of the Tech for Democracy, we are working to launch a new digital democracy initiative at the upcoming Summit for Democracy this week. It's a new flagship multi-donor program, which will, we expect, promote and protect local inclusive democratic space in a digital age. I just read on Instagram that the Danish government has allocated 300 million Danish kroners to that initiative. Tech for Democracy is founded in a belief that we need the expertise and the insight of all stakeholders in order to find demand-driven, responsible, and sustainable solutions. For Denmark, the Tech for Democracy initiative is a platform and a commitment to work together with all relevant stakeholders. Tech for Democracy might be initiated by the Danish government, but it is alive and thriving because of solid and engaged partners that has brought their experience, their diligence, their efforts, their visions of a shared digital future to the table. IMS is very much at the forefront of this work. We are committed to harnessing the great potential of digital technologies to improve not only the livelihood of people, but for free, democratic, and open societies as a whole. Please let me conclude the remarks of the Danish theologian and church historian who wrote a book, What is Democracy? I brought it with me here today. He wrote it in the 1940s, not long after the Second World War. The book focuses on the way in which democracy has been in danger of losing outcome achieved once and for all, but a task constantly revisited. I think it speaks very well to what we are doing today. It's a continuous work that we have to work with. We have to adapt. I think the comparison between Myanmar and Ukraine very well notes that there are comparisons, but the situation is also very different. But the point being here that those offline words from a book from the 1940s, long before the internet, still seems to be equally relevant today and serves as a segue into our discussion today, focusing on what can be done to mitigate undemocratic control of the internet, with examples from Ukraine and Myanmar. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I hope we'll have a good and productive discussion today. And now I'd like to turn over to Nynne, who's our co-moderator today for the panel. Nynne, over to you.
Sounds on now. For setting the scene for us, Anders and Jesper. And welcome to everyone who's joining us online. I'll just briefly introduce who we're here today. We have Yevgen Fedchenko, who's the co-founder and chief editor of StopFake.org in Ukraine, one of the leading fact-checking organizations. We have a representative of Myanmar Data Citizens, who works with data tech and journalism in Myanmar, and who will remain anonymous for safety reasons, and will refer to them as MDC throughout the event. We have Ginny Badanes, who's the Senior Director of Microsoft Democracy Forward Initiative, with us from Washington, D.C. Then we have Anders Lundstrup Gravgaard, the Charge d'Affaires of the Danish Embassy in Myanmar. And we are Magnus A., my colleague, who's a public interest tech advisor at IMS, and myself, who works with Magnus and and is a tech specialist at IMS.
Yes, thank you so much, Nune, and welcome everybody. Really excited to see you all, both speakers here and everyone joining online. This has really been a long endeavor for us to work on this report, but also a truly exciting one. And as Anna said, I think you call that battle of that continuous work, and I think in the report we call it a deliberative process, building on similar philosophies, right? And how important these conversations are. There's none of us. We focus on the public interest and public interest infrastructure, right? But I think one of the main conclusions of the report is that this is something ongoing, similar to your point there. And therefore, these conversations, and in particular, these conversations across sectors, are so crucially important. I think we're never going to get anywhere without them, and we're very fortunate to be part of them. So what we thought we would do now was give you a little bit of a teaser, since we just launched this report today. We promise you we won't go into depth. Like, for those of you who are interested enough, and we would be honored if you are, please go ahead and read it. But we'll just give you now a couple of kind of quick pointers to where we are heading with this report.
And please know that you can find the report on the same page that you're live streaming this.
I trust. Woman here talking about how it's hard in these digital spaces to change the status quo, and when you're so reliant on them, talking into this, that the business models of many of the media operations we work with out in countries like Pakistan are very dependent on social media, but also have big issues with social media and are kind of stuck in that game. And then in that problem analysis, we go all the way to kind of the more academic, analytical approach of, for example, Shoshana Zuboff and kind of her arguments about surveillance capitalism and what that's doing to democracy, trying to bridge that into something that makes sense from our media development perspective, and then actually to look forward, to present this idea that the public interest can be more guiding in our digital infrastructures, and then looking at how we can do that. And that we do with concrete examples, for example.
It leads us to a collection of solutions that we are excited about, that all in different ways address some of the major issues we see with the current digital infrastructures, like disinformation and hate speech, or the lack of data from social media companies to get a true overview of the scales. These solutions are sort of sprinkled across the report, and some solutions are in shape of social media platforms like Jamii forums in Tanzania or Inform app in Myanmar. And some are examples of legislations and other things. And they are supposed to be an appetizer for the many interesting things that are already going on and cases to look to and be inspired by.
And then we have a chapter that we won't go so much into because we have the author with us here today, or one of the authors, and so MDC, we're really looking forward to this, but a very in-depth and nuanced look at online risk and social resilience in Myanmar, at the spaces like that have worked through the recent years and that haven't worked, some of them, for example, facilitated by Facebook and others. We leave that for now and then jump to the next kind of focus of the report.
We have another chapter by two researchers from Copenhagen University, as well as our colleague and co-editor of this report, Emilie Lehmann-Jacobsen, who's done a thorough data research and analysis of the infrastructure of the internet in Myanmar. And they've created this overview of how data travels through the very physical infrastructures and how it can be obstructed and be subject to surveillance on its way. And it gives a very clear idea of why we need to take a look at other parts of the infrastructures than on the algorithmic or app level. The research group has also gathered data on how the most popular apps in Myanmar, how the data are shared from these apps to third-party companies, and it all of this sort of shows how the current infrastructure in Myanmar is enabling the military to control the information flow and to set up a digital dictatorship in Myanmar.
And then we round kind of how do we get there, and what's the path if we want to talk about this ambitious vision of public interest infrastructure? Like what that sounds challenging, and it is, and we're bold and say this might take 30 years. This is not like one app or one piece of legislation that's going to fix it. But as democratic societies and movements around the world, we have the power, we have legitimacy to actually ask more of our digital infrastructures, and we gotta be part of that. And we want to see how we can contribute coming from a media development perspective. So what we've identified is that, first of all, start reimagining. That's not easy, but kind of, we're so used to thinking of social media in a certain way. So that's why we included some alternative ways of doing it. And then set that vision, like where do you want to go, instead of, there's a lot of work in digital space that for good reasons are very reactive, critical of the very challenging situations people are in digital space. But we want to also kind of, what is the alternative? What is it we can present? One thing that we can add, I think, is bringing journalism, as Jesper pointed out in his opening remarks, experiences of 100 years of a profession that have tried to serve the public interest, not always successful, but at least there's been an effort. There's been these battles that continues to kind of improve those workflows. Similar, build coalitions. Like, this is not going to be a journalistic solution or effort by itself in any means. This is going to be broad, multi-stakeholder, democratic societies, movements around the world coming together to be at this level that we're aiming for. And then, as we also heard already a couple of times, anchor locally. Some of our current challenges are, of course, because global companies have a difficult time assessing what's the need of the local population. So there's something really interesting between this kind of anchor locally and scale the impact and on the solution. Stay optimistic and realistic. This can be daunting, right? So you have to kind of keep your head high and move forward, but also be realistic. Like, this is not a kind of blindly idealistic undertaking. This is very strategic, but long-term. So be realistic and look at the first steps you can take here. And always, of course, found on a human rights-based and intersectional approach. That's a given in every work we do. And that's kind of where we want to set the bar even higher. You serve the public interest. Of course, we respect human rights. You can't really get anywhere without that. So that's the key things we recommend. Then at the very end of the report, we have a list of recommendations that I encourage you to go see. And we just wanted to end on this last one, that you can't do it alone. We already said it a couple of times. And I think the collaborative spirit of this panel and this opportunity we have now to speak to colleagues from around the world that represent this cutting edge work being done in Ukraine and in Myanmar with the very different scenarios we are in, but equally important, then one of these big companies that have really invested in journalism and done interesting and exciting work with us and with many others around the world, and as well as a democratic nation state that have engaged for many years in bringing in civil society and currently with this Tech for Democracy initiative. I'm truly grateful and excited for this conversation that we're going to kick off. And I'm going to do that by asking questions for the panelists that will then give fairly short answers and then kind of lead into a conversation. I have the first question, and then I'll pass it to Yevgen, who's this first one I'm going to ask, and then Nune will have questions as well, and we go a little bit back and forth like that. So Yevgen, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for being part of all kind of interesting, fascinating work. We keep learning from you, and we're very grateful also to have you part of at the roundtables on One Disinformation in Ukraine. And it's really been a pleasure to work with you and to see your operations and see how the rest of us can learn so much from that. So given the very dire situation Ukraine is in, I wonder if you can kind of describe to us a little bit, how is it right now working in the digital spaces during a war, but maybe also with an eye to kind of, what has the change been? Like, what has the past 8-9 years been like in these spaces as you've found it, Stop Fake, etc.? And what changed now that there is a war and it is a global defining situation as it wasn't before? Like, can you talk us through a little bit of your observations there, maybe interesting in solutions you've seen it? Thank you. Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion. Indeed, Ukraine went a kind of a long and painful way of understanding how important digital instruments can be, because when you have a war, information is something which literally influences death or life situation, because if you are better informed, you have kind of better chances to survive. And my school, which I lead, was a kind of early pioneering organizations in Ukraine to move Ukraine to digital agenda and digital instruments for journalism. And of course, at that point, there were still a lot of discussions. As always, is it good or bad, or what is kind of more goods or more bads in this transition? But the answer was, we go with the transition anyway, and we would see very different developments, how technologies can influence people's life. And of course, on one hand, we are saying that yes, this war was enabled by disinformation, and digital instruments were essential to push that disinformation on Ukraine. And infrastructure, access to information, numerous digital media outlets which are around, access to internet, which was essential during all the days of this war, and it was almost never interrupted, except situation when there was power. All times journalists were not capable to do their job because just there was no access to internet. Sometimes it's kind of situations where you literally understand the importance of having those instruments, and sometimes when you do not have that, you feel how it's to do journalism without having access to all those assets which most journalists around the world today consider to be the norm. And most people just cannot imagine how is your life without having internet, for example. That's exactly true during the last winter, and all Ukrainian media organizations were very helpful to anyone who was helping to set up any kind of supporting lifelines, newsrooms. For example, fake have a separate small hub, journalism, where they always can have access to electricity. So those things are really considered to be essential and omnipresent, and no one already can imagine how to do journalism without all that. And when only you do not have all that, you can imagine what it is to be without all that. It's really was a kind of moment in the journalism when you understand that without new technologies, you definitely cannot do journalism per se. You cannot reach out to your audiences, you cannot get information, and you cannot disseminate information. So basically, without that, you just come to the blackout, literal blackout, and then you have kind of informational and digital blackout. So I think the most important here is to, as always, to kind of balance those two approaches. So what is more important, not to have instruments to deliver disinformation, or not to have instruments to develop journalism. And of course, Again, there is no kind of there are different views on how technologies would influence journalism in the future, but definitely right now, Ukraine is a great example to understand the importance of having that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this, Jürgen. And I think your question is quite relevant as well for the next speaker from Myanmar, whose media and infrastructure development is quite recent. And MDC, I have two questions for you. One is what the current working situation is like for journalists in Myanmar, or Myanmar journalists in the digital space. And the other one is that in your chapter in the report, you conclude that there's been both upsides and downsides to having Facebook as such a dominant digital infrastructure in Myanmar, and in the challenging environment today, where the crisis is still going on in Myanmar, where do you see journalists being able to express themselves and share information digitally and otherwise?
Thank you, Nuna. First of all, I'm very honored to be invited on this panel with such esteemed guests, with colleagues from Ukraine, Microsoft, and of course, Chargé d'Affaires. Before I answer the question that you raised, Nuna, I think we need to go back a little bit, 10 years ago, when Myanmar started going down a path of this very rapid digital transformation. So you have to imagine, before 2014, it was very, very expensive to get an internet connection, and most people barely had landline phones, and very, very few people had SIM cards. And the price of SIM cards suddenly, as a lot of liberalization reforms and democratic reforms came in the middle of the 2010s, we got from SIM cards that cost about $200 to SIM cards that cost about $2 overnight, and everyone going from never having used a laptop or the internet before to being able to get cheap smartphones and being instantly connected to the internet. So in a way, Myanmar has always been a canary in a coal mine it's like an experimental ground for testing how a rapidly digitizing population leads to all kinds of socio-political problems. And as the Chargé d'Affaires had pointed out, we have had truly horrific consequences of that, as exemplified by the crisis in Northern Rakhine, which led to tremendous human rights abuses, especially against the Rohingya population. And then following that, we have gotten to a situation right now where, since the coup of 2021, where we initially had the overturning of a democratically elected government right after the elections on claims of electoral fraud, and months of peaceful protests that were violently cracked down, and which have evolved in the last 2 years into a full-scale civil war. So just some numbers I wanted to cite. First, from the Association of Assistance for Political Prisoners, which is a very prominent human rights organization based in Myanmar. They have documented over 3,000 civilians killed and over 20,000 arrested. And this is from the perspective of brutality of the military. But in terms of the civil war, it is now a full-scale civil war of the likes that our country has never seen before. And contemporarily in the world right now, we have had in the year 2022 over 20,000 deaths due to the conflict. And this is second only to Ukraine in the world, and quite comparable, actually. I think from the data that I've seen, the deaths due to conflict in Ukraine were 25,000 or something like that, whereas in Myanmar is 20,000. So this is something where I think the narrative has been that there has been a coup, there has been civil unrest, there has been a resistance movement, but I think very few people talk about it as a full-scale civil war, which it is, right? So if you look at, given that situation, what has happened to the lives of journalists and the work that they do, as our colleague Yevgen has said, it's very difficult, first of all, for journalists today to do their work without appropriate digital infrastructure. And in a lot of ways, we are almost rest assured that given the extent of penetration of the internet in Myanmar today, since the mid-2010s, the military government right now can't afford to shut down the internet completely. They would love to. They would love to completely shut down the internet, but they are not able to just because the internet is so ingrained with the infrastructure for financial transactions, the infrastructure for various kinds of communications that we just do on an everyday basis. That said, of course, digital security has become incredibly important. As Magnus and Nina was pointing out, the military has complete control over the data flows that happen on the internet. In addition to the digital surveillance, there's also physical surveillance of devices. So if you are traveling from town to town in Myanmar, you get checked at checkpoints. If you even have some photos in your phone that might indicate that you're an activist, you're arrested. Propaganda social media channels routinely dox journalists and activists. So disinformation has morphed into this vengeful thing that weaponizes the small minority of military supporters and their hatred towards the resistance movement. And another thing is payments infrastructure has become very difficult. So if you are donating to a cause or trying to pay your staff, and that happens through mobile money or digital transaction, that becomes a way for them to track as well. So media has become much more dependent on donor funding because ad revenue right now is out of the question. It used to be not a healthy mix per se, but there were avenues of business models that were being tried out within the country. Moreover, there are a mix of most organizations will have a mix of team members who are based outside the country and inside the country. And the people who have been exiled, they are in neighboring countries such as Thailand, such as Cambodia, and these countries are also have authoritarian tendencies in their own ways, and they are not very friendly to journalists themselves. So even the people who have escaped the country also face additional problems. And another thing is because a lot of the journalists have become exiled, it's very difficult to report and verify information on the ground because they can only do so through digital means and the limited network of people who are informing the independent media that still exists. And on top of all of that, the reporting on these very dire issues day in and day out for more than 2 years now has taken a huge toll on journalists. All the journalist friends that I know, all the civil society friends that I know, having to write stories about abuse, about conflict day in and day out has really taken a toll. So I guess that answers your first question, Nuna. I don't know if I have enough time to go on to the second part yet, but happy to talk about that later, or if you want me to continue, I can do that.
Yes, thank you so much, Andisi. I think I would love to hear more, and I think we could go on for hours on each of these. Like the complexity of this panel is, of course, also high. Like you're such in-depth knowledge of very complex situations. But I want to get through all the panelists before we kind of circle back. So now I want to flip it to Jenny from Microsoft and hear your perspective. And maybe first of all, thank you for a great collaboration. On behalf of IMS, we've had you at the roundtable on Ukraine from the start, and as a driver and as a really inspiring company to work together with that have taken up kind of specific technical challenges with us, and we've experimented in kind of NGO company collaborations. And also kind of hear from your president all the way up, Brad Smith, saying like, as a global company, we have a responsibility to support journalism. So we are eager to hear kind of your learnings from Ukraine, maybe in particular, but also then how does that tie into where you see global developments, your engagement, maybe even in Myanmar. I'm not sure how much you have going on there, but like what have you seen as a company engaged in this space for the past year and before that?
Thanks, Magnus. Well, I should thank you for, first of all, inviting me here today, but also for your leadership in pulling a lot of the tech companies together with that vital community of Ukrainian journalists and civil society actors so early in the war. I know that from Microsoft's perspective, it was extremely helpful to hear from those who are closer to what was happening, and to build that connection very early on. I'll say that one thing that we've understood from your findings and really to your point about some of the positions Brad, our president, has taken early on, is that technology companies have a responsibility when it comes to building out partnerships and creating authoritative content and being aware of public interest infrastructure and how to be a part of building them. And so, we're really appreciative to be part of the conversation. I'll say that one of our biggest learnings was that local context connected with a way to provide us details was really the key. So I know that there were a lot of instances where we were invited to working groups and roundtables with people on the ground providing us with insights and information, and that was incredibly valuable. But I think where the next step went, and where I think it ties into what you're talking about as far as building out infrastructure, was the ability to communicate details to the technology companies, things like domains, and URLs and handles for certain social media accounts. I know that was particularly helpful to a lot of the other technology firms who have social media platforms. That was an area where we really took it from just conversation and context setting, again, which was valuable, and moved it into actionable. How do we actually take these insights and look at how it applies to our own products, and how do we fulfill the commitment that we've made to our customers of providing them a time when, frankly, the information ecosystem was very murky. And we recognize that that is the case in many regions and countries around the world, if not the entire world. We have a very complicated information ecosystem right now. And we recognize that there are people who are very intentionally trying to feed inaccurate, incorrect propaganda into that ecosystem. So the better that we can get that local context and knowledge, and then again, details to, of course, apply our own lens of consideration and vetting, but being able to have that source of information to apply to our own products and fulfill that obligation is really important. I also want to pick up on another thing that I think I've both seen in the report and also heard in several comments this morning, which is the incredible value of independent journalism and media around the world, and sort of an acknowledgement that that is at risk, and that we are seeing the decline in journalism around the world, and also sort of acknowledging the role that technology companies have played in undermining the both the business model in many ways. To MDC's comments, the actual setup of how people get and consume information, and recognizing the disruption that technology companies have played in that. And one of the things that our leadership has spoken about a lot is the need for technology companies to acknowledge that, recognize it, and lean into solutions. In the report, you mentioned the value of private-public partnerships. And so it ties in really nicely, actually, to an announcement that we just made this morning, which is that we're partnering with USAID to build a media viability accelerator, which is essentially going to be a web-based platform for publishers around the world to use to support independent media outlets with financially sustainable information, and helping them to access market insights and business solutions. And so that kind of investment from federal government and technology solutions and investments from a technology company together to try and provide tools and resources necessary to help these media companies around the world grow and learn and improve, recognizing sort of the disruption that's occurred in this industry, I think is an important step forward. And those are the kinds of opportunities that we'll continue to look for.
Yeah, thank you so much for your perspectives, Jenny. I think this leads very well over to you, Anders, now that we've heard both perspectives from a company and from Ukraine and Myanmar. I'd like to ask you, how do you see the role of smaller democratic nations, and how they can make the biggest difference in these collaborations with the various stakeholders? For example, in a Myanmar context.
Well, I mean, from the Myanmar context, I think we built up some experiences because both we were present there with the government, of course, but also IMS had a long history there and was very present. So I think it speaks to the fact that there's always been sort of a strong historical ties to to the civil society, to the government, and we could sort of build on that. I'm not sure that small countries are the only ones who have. And I think building from that then made this ecosystem being able to react as fast as we saw it, for instance, in Ukraine, building on the history of other places. So that shortened the reaction time. And I think then, of course, there's been a tradition to support independent media and civil society for a great number of years. So there's a really strong work relationship there. That I think that's basically the short answer. I think I'll pick up maybe also on Dini's point of people on the ground. I think that's quite a very valid point for us to have this continuous discussion. I talked to my IMS representatives on a very often basis and discuss the next step of our cooperationship, and it's been extremely fruitful to continue this dialogue on a continuous basis. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for these insights. I'm stunned, and it's we have a few minutes left, 8 to be precise, to kind of circle back on some of the points. And as an organization, I'd actually like to pull back a little bit and be in the background. I want to hear if any of you have a specific point or thing you heard that you want to pick up from one of the other speakers. If not, I'm happy to ask kind of direct questions. But I want to leave it a little open. And I know you, MDC, you had some additional points. So that could be an opportunity for you.
Yes, Douglas. I would love to talk about, I know from my first round of comments, I focused on a lot of very pessimistic things, or not maybe really pessimistic, but it's just the reality on the ground that just happens to be very dire. But the chapter that we wrote in the report really looks at how, even though we are, living in an authoritarian government, even during the reform era, and now in a complete military dictatorship, and even though most of the digital technologies that our people had to use were not designed and built with their needs and wants, it's large private companies for whom Myanmar is not even a big market, so they were not built with our people in mind. Even though all of these things exist, there were lots of examples that we could find where the population was able to kind of expropriate, I guess would be the right word to use, these existing technological platforms to have some sort of bottom-up engagement with the stakeholders on the ground. So the chapter that we wrote focused on one case study in particular where there's this government department called the Pollution Control and Cleaning Department out of the municipal government of Yangon, which is the largest city, where the lowest level of administrators use Facebook to build up these community pages that really allowed people from the neighborhood to engage directly with civil servants, especially the ones who are responsible for cleaning up the neighborhoods. And this really flies in the face of the traditions of how power operated in Myanmar, where we have had a succession of authoritarian governments, and on top of that, inherited colonial heritage from the British of a very, very top-down command and control government and power structure. And so, even though Facebook was not designed for local government officials to talk to their representatives, it was hacked almost to be used in this way, right? So Myanmar people are incredibly ingenious and incredibly able to take what they are given and do ingenious things with it. So I wanted to get a little bit on what we mean by permissionless innovation. I really love that term. Unfortunately, it's a term that comes from a very Silicon Valley libertarian kind of angle. It's mostly used in that term, in that sense, but I really think it's also something that's very important if we're talking about public service digital infrastructure. So first of all, Permissionless means there's no need for a hierarchical approval process. You can just start something that you think is a good idea. There's no cost or technical skills required. That's the magic of Facebook, right? You can just start anything you want on Facebook at no cost and without any technical skills. And because all these little groups that were started were able to be duplicated by people, government officials in other towns, in other neighborhoods, this copying and improvement takes place. So it evolves to solve more problems. And because the innovations were being conducted by the people on the ground who were closest to the stakeholders, the people for whom like Ginny was saying, the local stakeholders, these innovations and these kind of iterative improvements were battle tested right there and then, right? Like in the startup world, we'd like to talk about the lean process where we're like creating as much as we can, and that's happening in this way as well. And it's built with community right from the get-go, because that's another benefit that Facebook brings. So just some points on what I think about permissionless innovation there.
Thank you very much, MDC, and really interesting perspective. And I think also from our privileged position here in Copenhagen, working with partners all over the world, what we see often is innovation power in emergency situations and in times of crisis are truly impressive. That is when humans come up with good ideas. So kind of this default, oh, we should just look to Silicon Valley, etc. I don't think it's true. Like there are amazing things happening all over. The challenging question is this scale. How do you anchor it locally and scale at the same time? I don't know, Ian. Again, if you have a minute, it's a tricky question, but you worked in operations of fact-checking and then kind of looking at how that scales and incorporate that in the big company structures. Do you have a 1-minute answer on that? And then we have to round it up to stay within our time limit. Sorry to give you such a tough one.
Yeah, I will try to squeeze this very kind of difficult question into 1 minute. So I think we should look here like short-term approach versus long-term approach. So we've seen how different technological companies started to work very actively on fighting disinformation, for example. But on one hand, it mostly happened only when invasion already started. And now, as a second point, we see how many of them are already cooling down on this idea, thinking that this problem is already solved. So looking from fact-checking point of view and monitoring data, we see that the problem is the opposite. So the problem with disinformation and dissemination is very far from being solved. And actually, it's increasing into many parts of the world, including in the countries of Global South, which are pretty much overlooked because, for example, over there is no any sanctions against Russian disinformation media outlets. They're just limited to Global North countries. And I was specifically looking into Spanish language media landscapes throughout the world. And we notice a huge problem over there. And we really need to pay attention to that. And that's why I'm talking about kind of long-term approach and a lot of kind of patience to solve this problem, not to just postpone it because it would be dangerous. We would give the second chance for disinformation to flourish in that environment.
Thank you so much, and also for your discipline in delivering such a high-level answer on such spot-on timing. I would want to ask you all many more questions, and I think Nynne would also. And I also want to acknowledge that this is the tip of the iceberg, and given the security situation, some of these conversations need to happen offline. And I really want to thank Anders and Ginny and Yevgen and MDC for joining us. I have learned a lot, and I look really forward to collaborating, to working, as Ginny said, be specific, get the URLs, get the right stuff to the right companies, but also be visionary, as some of you have addressed. Like, we want to see this change, and let's go make it happen. So, unless you have anything else to add, Nynne?
Just one tiny thing. If people have entered a little late, then you can now find the full report and download it on the same page as you are live streaming this. Unless you're on YouTube, then go to IMS's website, mediasupport.org.
Yes, and this is, we don't have the answers. It's a collaborative effort. We would love input, ideas, feedback, suggestion. Please reach out. We are on the channels. You find our contact information on our website. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a good evening. Have a good day wherever you are. We're really grateful for your contributions and very optimistic about the future, even in these hard conditions. Thank you, everybody.